It's quite fascinating that I that my pronunciation is improving rapidly. I like this. I like this a lot. Yeah. This is a very strong motive for everyone to practice more. The more you practice, the more you sound like a native. Time to continue our story. The story of Gulliver's Travels. Part 2, Chapter 4. Whenever I had a mind to see the town, it was always in my travelling closet, which Glum de la Clutch held in her lap in a kind of open sedan, after the fashion of the country, borne by 4 men and attended by 2 others in the Queen's livery. The people, who had often heard of me, were very curious to crowd about the sedan, and the girl was complacent. And the girl was complacent enough to make the bearers stop, and to take me in her hand, that I might be more conveniently seen. I was very desirous to see the chief temple, and particularly the tower belonging to it, which is reckoned the highest in the kingdom. Accordingly, one day, my nurse carried me thither. That's a very, very annoying word. I don't know how it's pronounced. Very annoying. Is it thither or thither?
Thither.
Thither?
Thither.
Very annoying word. Okay. Thither.
Thither.
Okay. But I may truly say I came back disappointed, for the height is not above the 3,000. Is not above 3,000 feet, reckoning from the ground to the highest pinnacle top, which, allowing for the difference between the size of those people and us in Europe, is no great matter for admiration, nor at all equal in proportion, if I rightly remember, to Salisbury steeple. But, not to detract from a nation to which, during my life, I shall acknowledge myself extremely obliged, it must be allowed that whatever this famous tower wants in height is amply made up in beauty and strength, for the walls are near 100 feet thick, built of hewn stone, whereof each is about 40 feet square, and adorned on all sides with statues of gods and emperors, cut in marble, larger than the life, placed in their several niches. I measured the little finger which had fallen down from one of these statues, and lay unperceived among some rubbish, and found it exactly 4 feet and an inch in length. Glum de la Clutch wrapped it up in her handkerchief, and carried it home in her pocket, to keep among other trinkets, of which the girl was very fond, as children at her age usually are. The king's kitchen is indeed a noble building, vaulted at top, and about 600 feet high. The great oven is not so wide, by 10 paces, as the cupola at St. Paul's, for I measured the latter on purpose. After my return. But if I should describe the kitchen grate, the produce pots and kettles, the joints of meat turning on the spits, with many other particulars, Perhaps I should be hardly believed. At least a severe critic would be apt to think I enlarged a little, as travellers are often suspected to do. To avoid which censure, censor or censure, let's see.
Censure.
Censure, okay. To avoid which censure, I fear I have run too much into the other extreme, and that if this treatise should happen to be translated into the language of Brodignang, whatever, which is the general name of that kingdom, and transmitted thither, the king and his people would have reason to complain that I had done them an injury by a false and diminutive representation. His Majesty seldom keeps above 600 horses in his stables. They are generally from 54 to 60 feet high, but when he goes abroad on solemn days, he is attended for state by a military guard of 500 horse, which indeed I thought was the most splendid sight that could be ever beheld, till I saw part of his army in Battalia, whereof I shall find another occasion to speak. Chapter 5. Several adventures that happened to the author. The execution of a criminal. The author shows his skill in navigation. I should have lived happy enough in that country if my littleness had not exposed me to several ridiculous and troublesome accidents, some of which I shall venture to relate. Glum de la Clich often carried me into the gardens of the court in my smaller box, and would sometimes take me out of it and hold me in her hand, or sit me down to walk. I remember, before the dwarf left the queen, he followed us one day into those gardens, and my nurse having set me down, he and I being close together, near some dwarf apple trees, I must needs show my wit by a silly allusion between him and the trees, which happens to hold in their language as it does in ours. Whereupon the malicious rogue, watching his opportunity when I was walking under one of them, shook it directly over my head, by which a dozen apples, each of them near as large as a Bristol barrel, came tumbling about my ears. One of them hit me on the back as I chanced to stoop, and knocked me down flat on my face. But I received no other hurt, and the dwarf was pardoned at my desire. Because I had given the provocation. Okay, good progress. Another day, Glum de la Clich left me on a smooth grass plot to divert myself, while she walked at some distance with her governess. In the meantime, there suddenly fell such a violent shower of hail that I was immediately, by the force of it, struck to the ground, and when I was down, the hailstones gave me such cruel bangs all over the body as if I had been pelted with tennis balls. However, I made a shift to creep on all fours and shelter myself by laying flat on my face on the lee side of the border of lemon thyme, but so bruised from head to foot that I could not go abroad in 10 days. Neither is this at all to be wondered at, because nature in that country, observing the same proportion through all her operations, a hailstone is near 1800 times as large as one in Europe, which I can assert upon experience, having been so curious as to weigh and measure them. But a more dangerous accident happened to me in the same garden, when my little nurse, believing she had put me in a secure place, which I often entreated her to do, that I might enjoy my own thoughts, and having left my box at home to avoid the trouble of carrying it, went to another part of the garden with her governess and some ladies of her acquaintance. While she was absent and out of hearing, a small white spaniel that belonged to one of the chief gardeners, having got by accident into the garden, happened to range near the place where I lay. The dog, following the scent, came directly up, and taking me in his mouth, ran straight to his master, wagging his tail, and set me gently on the ground. By good fortune, he had been so well taught that I was carried between his teeth without the least hurt, or even tearing my clothes. But the poor gardener, who knew me well and had a great kindness for me, was in a terrible fright. He gently took me up in both his hands and asked me how I did. But I was so amazed and out of breath that I could not speak a word. In a few minutes I came to myself, and he carried me safe to my little nurse, who, by this time, had returned to the place where she left me, and was in cruel agonies when I did not appear. Not sure how this is pronounced, so let's check.
Agony.
Agony. Okay, it's plural for agony, agonies. Okay, it works very well. And was in cruel agonies when I did not appear, nor answer when she called. She severely reprimanded the gardener on account of his dog, but the thing was hushed up. And never known at court, for the girl was afraid of the queen's anger. And truly, as to myself, I thought it would not be for more reputation that such a story should go about. This accident absolutely determined Glum de la Clutch. This accident absolutely determined Glum de la Clutch never to trust me abroad for the future out of her sight. I had been long afraid of this resolution, and therefore concealed from her some little unlucky adventures. I had been long afraid of this resolution, and therefore concealed from her some little unlucky adventures that happened in those times when I was left by myself. Once a kite hovering over the garden made a stoop at me, and if I had not resolutely drawn my hanger and run under a thick spalier, he would have certainly carried me away in his talons. Another time, walking to the top of a fresh molehill, I fell to my neck in the hole, through which that animal had cast up the earth and coined some lie, not worth remembering, to excuse myself for spoiling my clothes. I likewise broke my right chin against the shell of a snail, which I happened to stumble over as I was walking alone and thinking on poor England. I cannot tell whether I were more pleased or mortified to observe, in those solitary walks, that the smaller birds did not appear to be at all afraid of me, but would hop about within a yard's distance, looking for worms and other food, with as much indifference and security as if no creature at all were near them. I remember I remember a thrush had the confidence to snatch out of my hand with his bill a piece of cake that Glum de la Clich had just given me for my breakfast. When I attempted to catch any of these birds, they would boldly turn against me. When I attempted to catch any of these birds, they would boldly turn against me, endeavoring to pick my fingers, which I durst not venture within their reach, and then they would hop back unconcerned, to hunt for worms or snails as they did before. But one day I took a thick cudgel and threw it with all my strength, so luckily at a linnet that I knocked him down and seizing him by the neck with both my hands, ran with him in triumph to my nurse. However, the bird, who had only been stunned, recovering himself gave me so many boxes with his wings on both sides of my head and body, though I held him at arm's length and was out of the reach of his claws, that I was 20 times thinking to let him go. But I was soon relieved by one of our servants, who wrung off the bird's neck, and I had him next day for dinner, by the Queen's command. He ate the little bird. How sad. This linnet, as near as I can remember, seemed to be somewhat larger than an English swan. The maids of honor often invited Glum de la Clich to their apartments and desired she would bring me along with her, on purpose to have the pleasure of seeing and touching me. They would often strip me naked from top to toe and lay me at full length in their bosoms, wherewith I was much disgusted, because, to say the truth, a very offensive smell came from their skins, which I do not mention or intend to the disadvantage of those excellent ladies, for whom I have all manner of respect, but I conceive that my sense was more acute in proportion to my littleness, and that those illustrious persons, okay, let's see, that's pronounced illustrious,
illustrious,
was more acute in proportion to my littleness, and that those illustrious persons were no more disagreeable to their lovers or to each other than people of the same quality are with us in England. And, after all, I found their natural smell was much more supportable than when they used perfumes, under which I immediately swooned away. I cannot forget that an intimate friend of mine in Lilliput took the freedom in a warm day, when I had used a good deal of exercise, to complain of a strong smell about me, although I am as little faulty that way as most of my sex. But I suppose his faculty of smelling was as nice with regard to me as mine was to that of this people. Upon this point, I cannot forbear doing justice to the Queen, my mistress, and Glum de la Clich, my nurse, whose persons were as sweet as those of any lady in England. That which gave me most uneasiness among these maids of honor, when my nurse carried me to visit them, was to see them use me without any manner of ceremony, like a creature who had no sort of consequence. For they, would strip themselves to the skin and put on their smocks in my presence, while I was placed on their toilet, directly before their naked bodies, which I am sure to me was very far from being a tempting sight, or from giving me any other emotions than those of horror and disgust. Their skins appeared so coarse and uneven, so variously colored, when I saw them near, with a mole here and there as broad as a trencher, and hairs hanging from it, thicker than back threads. To say nothing farther concerning the rest of their persons, neither did they at all scruble, while I was by, to discharge what they had drank, to the quantity of at least 2 hogsheads, in a vessel that held above 3 tons. The handsomest among these maids of honor, a pleasant, frolicsome girl of 16, would sometimes set me astride upon one of her nipples, with many other tricks, wherein the reader will excuse me for not being over particular. But I was so much displeased that I entreated Glumdalclitch to contrive some excuse for me not seeing that young lady any more. One day, a young gentleman, who was nephew to my nurse's governess, came and pressed them both to see an execution. It was of a man who had murdered one of that gentleman's intimate acquaintance. Glumdalclitch was prevailed on to be of the company, very much against her inclination, for she was naturally tender-hearted, and as for myself, although I abhorred such kind of spectacles, yet my curiosity tempted me to see something that I thought must be extraordinary. The malefactor was fixed in a chair upon a scaffold erected for that purpose, and his head cut off at one blow, with a sword of about 40 feet long. The veins and arteries spouted up such a prodigious quantity of blood, and so high in the air that the great jet de vue at Versailles was not equal to it for the time it lasted, and the head, when it fell on the scaffold floor, gave such a bounce as made me start, although I was at least half an English mile distant. The Queen, who often used to hear me talk of my sea voyages, and took all occasions to divert me when I was melancholy, asked me whether I understood how to handle a sail or an oar, and whether a little exercise of rowing might not be convenient for my health. I answered that I understood both very well, for although my proper employment had been to be surgeon or doctor to the ship, yet often, upon a pinch, I was forced to work like a common mariner. But I could not see how this could be done in their country, where the smallest wherry was equal to the first-rate man of war among us, and such a boat as I could manage would never live in any of their rivers. Her Majesty said, if I would contrive a boat, her own joiner should make it, and she would provide a place for me to sail in. The fellow was an ingenious workman, and by my instructions, in 10 days, finished a pleasure boat with all its tackling, able conveniently to hold 8 Europeans. When it was finished, the Queen was so delighted that she ran with it in her lap to the King, who ordered it to be put into a cistern full of water, with me in it, by way of trial, where I could not manage my two sculls or little oars for want of room. But the queen had before contrived another project. She ordered the joiner to make a wooden trough of 300 feet long, 50 broad, and 8 deep, which being well pitched to prevent leaking, was placed on the floor, along the wall, in an outer room of the palace. In an outer room of the palace. It had a cock near the bottom to let out the water when it began to grow stale, and 2 servants could easily fill it in half an hour. Here I often used to roam for my own diversion, as well as that of the queen and her ladies, who thought themselves well entertained with my skill and agility. Sometimes I would put up my sail, and then my business was only to steer, while the ladies gave me a gale with their fans, and when they were weary, some of their pages would blow my sail forward with their breath, while I showed my art by steering starboard or larboard as I pleased. When I had done, Glumdalclitch always carried back my boat into her closet and hung it on a nail to dry. In this exercise I once met an accident, which had like to have cost me my life, for one of the pages having put my boat into the trough, the governess who attended Glumdalclitch very officiously lifted me up to place me in the boat, but I happened to slip through her fingers and should infallibly have fallen down 40 feet upon the floor, if by the luckiest chance in the world I had not been stopped by a corking pin that stuck in the good gentlewoman's stomacher, the head of the pin passing between my shirt and the waistband of my breeches, and thus I was held by the middle in the air, till Glumdalclitch ran to my relief. Another time, one of the servants, whose office it was to fill my trough every 3rd day with fresh water, was so careless as to let a huge frog, not perceiving it, slip out of his pail. The frog lay concealed till I was put into my boat, but then, seeing a resting place, climbed up and made it lean so much on one side that I was forced to balance it with all my weight on the other to prevent overturning. When the frog was got in, it hopped at once half the length of the boat, and then over my head, backward and forward, daubing my face and clothes with its odious slime. The largeness of its features made it appear the most deformed animal that can be conceived. However, I desired Glumdalclitch to let me deal with it alone. I banged it a good while with one of my sculls, and at last forced it to leap out of the boat. But the greatest danger I ever underwent in that kingdom was from a monkey, who belonged to one of the clerks of the kitchen. Glumdalclitch had locked me up in her closet, while she went somewhere upon business, or a visit. The weather being very warm, the closet window was left open, as well as the windows and the door of my bigger box, in which I usually lived. Because of its largeness and conveniency, as I sat quietly meditating at my table, I heard something bounce in at the closet window, and skip about from one side to the other. Whereat, although I was much alarmed, yet I ventured to look out, but not stirring from my seat. And then I saw this frolicsome animal, frisking and leaping, frolicsome animal, frisking and leaping up and down, till at last he came to my box, which he seemed to view with great pleasure and curiosity, peeping in at the door and every window. I retreated to the farther corner of my room, or box, but the monkey, looking in at every side, put me in such a fright that I wanted presence of mind to conceal myself under the bed, as I might easily have done. After some time spent in peeping, grinning, and chattering, he at last espied me, and reaching one of his paws in at the door, as a cat does when she plays with a mouse. Although I often shifted place to avoid him, he at length seized the lappet of my coat, which being made of that country silk, was very thick and strong, and dragged me out. He took me up in his right forefoot, and held me as a nurse does a child she is going to suckle, just as I have seen the same sort of creature do with a kitten in Europe. And when I offered to struggle, he squeezed me so hard that I thought it more prudent to submit. I have good reason to believe that he took me for a young one of his own species, by his often stroking my face very gently with his other paw. In these diversions he was interrupted by a noise at the closed door, as if somebody were opening it, whereupon he suddenly leaped up to the window at which he had come in, and thence upon the leads and gutters, walking upon 3 legs, and holding me in the 4th, till he clambered up to a roof that was next to ours. I heard Glumdalclitch give a shriek at the moment he was carrying me out. The poor girl was almost distracted, that the quarter of the palace was all in an uproar. The servants ran from ladders. The monkey was seen by hundreds in the court, sitting upon the ridge of a building, holding me like a baby in one of his forepaws, and feeding me with the other, by cramming into my mouth some victuals he had squeezed out of the bag on one side of his chaps, and patting me when I would not eat, whereat many of the rabble below could not forbear laughing. Neither do I think they justly ought to be blamed, for without question the sight was ridiculous enough to everybody but myself. Some of the people threw up stones, hoping to drive the monkey down, but this was strictly forbidden, or else, very probably, my brains had been dashed out. That will be it for today, and I will see you in the next one.